So a couple of things to keep in mind as we start today's webinar. Any questions that you have, please use the Q&A function. There's also a chat, you can also raise your hand, but we're really going to be looking at that Q&A, so please put everything there. You're also recording this session, so you will receive a recording of today's presentation along with the slides that you are seeing now and the link to the full report shortly following this webinar. And we're going to turn things over. You're going to hear from two people today. So first is Ted Hart, the president and CEO of CAF America. And again, you'll get these slides so you can read all about him shortly after. We're also going to hear from Jessie Krafft, senior vice president of external affairs, also at CAF America. And if you're not familiar with CAF America, we have some background right here, as well as the mission and the top 3 R's as part of the values. And I'm going to pick things over now to Ted, who's going to talk about this month's report and the findings that we have here. Take it away, Ted.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start off by sharing with you a few dates. It was December 31st, 2019 in Wuhan, China, that the world recorded the first instance of a coronavirus that would become known as COVID-19. On January 20th of this year, the United States witnessed its first case, and on March 11th, the World Health Organization declared this virus a global pandemic. On March 18th, CAF America has sent much of its staff to work from home, although with the strength and determination of our Chief of Staff, Michael Peterson, who has reported to work every day during the pandemic, our office has remained open. Our staff has thrived, and we have added staff, and this is because of the surge in support from hundreds of our donors supporting tens of thousands of charities in great need around the world. Today, we deliver the 3rd installment of our Voice of Charities Facing COVID-19 Worldwide report. In the first 2 reports, we learned of charities and communities in turmoil. While it has only been a few months, absolutely nothing is the same. No one works the same, socializes the same, plays the same. Healthcare cannot be delivered the same, and more than 413,000 of our global brothers and sisters have already been lost to this virus. People are infected, but who's infected? People are hungry, how will they be fed? People are angry, protesting for a better life. This is not the first virus to take hold of the planet. It will not, we are told, be the last. This is perhaps the first virus in which humankind has said collectively that we are not willing to sacrifice 50 to 100 million lives as were lost a century ago. So perspective. Today we hear of charities around the world. We hear their voice, their resilience through our surveys. Charities working together to serve their communities through very difficult conditions with few resources. They are working hard to keep their doors open. They are making urgent appeals for unrestricted funds, seeking flexibility in the use of funding and bringing creativity to the services they provide. What do we know? The next 12 months represent a critical window through which we may see as many as 1/3 of charities close. Another third will reinvent themselves, and a remaining third may, after all this is over, be recognizable as the charities we once knew from a time before the virus called COVID-19 ruled Earth. It is the story of these 3 types of charities that we will share with our donors today as they continue to develop and redevelop their strategy for the role philanthropy will play in rebuilding the future of this world's social safety net and institutions of cultural significance. And joining me today is Jessie Krafft, and I want to share with you, next slide please. We had 414 charities join us in this survey, representing an all-time high of 125 countries. You can see those represented on this slide. Next slide, please. We want to give you on this slide a sense of the breakdown of the charities that are represented around the world in this survey and the charities in our prior two surveys, so you can see just how global our surveys are. Let's go to the next slide, and you'll see the breakdown of the charities represented in our charities. You can see it's a broad list of different types of charities, so it's not just one kind of charity that's represented in this report. Let's go to the next slide, and Jessie, if you'll join me here, because through all of these, so it's a lot of different kinds of charities. It's global. We now have 125 countries represented in this survey. So we can say that, you know, we really have the voice of charities coming through these surveys, but loud and clear, there is a negative impact of this global pandemic on charities, and they're feeling it.
Yeah, it is a shocking number to see through these three surveys, that how shockingly similar the expected negative impacts are amongst these three different surveys. And you know, through our surveys, we've received countless stories of difficulty and hardship and fear for the uncertainties that lie ahead. But underlying all of that has also been an incredible spirit of creativity and energy to continue providing the important services that each of these organizations brings to their community. Unfortunately, this statistics really shows the grim side of this, that nearly 95% of our charity respondents, 95 in the last survey, about 90% in this time, have been negatively impacted by the coronavirus, and that's not surprising given the state of affairs in our world. And we're seeing in this survey, we saw a little bit more confidence in their ability to adapt, but clearly this is still the vast majority of charities that have been negatively impacted, and that's something we need to pay attention to.
And we'll see as we go through these slides today, we're starting to see some change in the charity landscape, right? So some charities have already closed. Some charities are adapting and trying to make changes that are necessary. But Jessie, we're also seeing donors change. We're seeing donors adapt and listen. What are you and the advisors at Krafft America hearing in terms of donors adapting as charities are adapting?
Yeah, and we have a great slide on this a little bit later too, that really focuses on the different ways that donors are thinking about this.
Yeah, I don't want you to give away the store now, but I just want to give a little bit of a teaser to what does that mean in terms of the conversations that we're having?
Yeah, and I think the big word that defines the donor response right now is flexibility, and it's flexibility that we have not seen in the past with donors. There have always been a group of donors that have started to focus on unrestricted funding and to fund overhead costs, but I'd say that's still pretty few and far between. And that's very different from what we're seeing now, given this new landscape, that donors are being more responsive and flexible in their grant making and really trying to hear the concerns and the voices of their charity partners, because they need and want them to survive. And that's the situation that we're in, and that's the type of funding that donors are talking about, is survival and resilience funding.
That's right. Let's go on to the next slide. Jessie, I want to just set this up a little bit. We're starting to see is sort of what was in the first couple of surveys, a lot of fear, what felt like maybe some chaos, staffing issues, staffing problems, service problems, funding problems. And not that is no longer the case, but a few months into this, a lot of very hardworking charities, a lot of very hardworking volunteers, a lot of very hardworking funders, some of these things are starting to get worked out, if not completely worked out. At least there are some strategies that are in place. What we're starting to see is in the survey data, we're starting to see charities kind of fall into three different camps, right? So we're seeing charities that are maybe about a third of the charities feel that they're very likely, or their forecast is that they're just not seeing that they can survive more than 12 months, and that forecast that they have is that from a funding and a volunteer and a service provision, the next 12 months looks like their organization's not going to survive. And then another third, Jessie, are maybe trying to reinvent themselves. They're not certain. They're not saying that they're going to close. They could. It's still sort of that nebulous kind of chaos. They're working very hard. Maybe their strategies will work. Maybe their strategies will not work. It's a lot of hard work on the part of volunteers and charities and funders in sort of that middle category. And then there's about a third of charities that, not to say they're on easy street, not to say that there's no concerns there, but they feel that their strategies are working, or that their strategies are a little bit clear, their path is a little bit clear, and that they feel that they can remain open, pending any further, complete disruptions to everything, which of course we can't predict. Talk to me about sort of this, maybe a little bit of organizing of the chaos.
Yeah. So, this data here is one of the most troubling this is the most troubling outcome of the survey. And because I think it speaks a lot to our general social safety net that many of us have come to rely on around the globe. We're hearing stories of food banks that need to turn people away due to the lack of funding or due to increased demand or depleted supplies. We're hearing about important medical research programs that are completely halted or significantly slowed, or where their resources have been diverted to finding a solution or a vaccine for COVID-19 specifically. Which has, of course, negative implications on the other medical research that they were conducting. Schools are closed, of course, reopening slowly, but I mean, just a few days ago, the president of the Philippines stated that their schools would remain closed until a vaccine comes to be. And, so I think it's, we have to think about what this world would look like without these social safety nets, because a third of organizations are saying they're going to be forced to close down. And that's really significant. So we've been receiving a lot of negative feedback, but this is perhaps the most staggering that I think we really need to consider as donors and as charities ourselves, depending on those on the call. We need to think about this impact globally.
That's right. Let's go to the next slide, Jessie, because the next slide, really, it stares right out at you that 8% have already closed. And of course, we're our researchers, Kinga, Ela, and her team, we see that number. That's 8% that had enough still going on to fill out the survey and tell us that they have closed, right? So they're, what we're doing is sort of going through the data on trying to determine which charities have closed and don't have the resources to even fill out a survey and tell us that they're closed. So it's an inexact. This is a survey, not a science project here, but trying to provide information to donors that they can use on what's going on, on the ground here. So help us understand, for those who are still operating, what's going on, how are they still operating? Because it's not to say we're up and operating at 100%. What's going on even for those that are still in business?
Yeah, so fortunately, one of the positive figures here is that 28% are providing their regular services, but most are providing limited or new services, which both of which require a lot of creativity and innovative thinking in order to reimagine their typical services and to determine how they can continue providing their programs on a more limited basis where they've been able to. As an example of this, education programs have now made huge efforts to digitize their content and are now providing courses online. So that speaks to this 52% that's providing limited services. But their reach is limited because there are significant gaps with many students that don't have access to computers or the internet at home. And so we're seeing this new form of digital exclusion, even in the form of, the most important thing for our children, which is education. So we've made a few grants with the purchasing computers for children that are digitally excluded, just as an example of one of of the limited services that we're seeing happen with some of these organizations. But, fortunately, the majority are still providing limited or new services to respond to COVID-19.
And Jessie, this can be really good for charities to expend the energy of reinventing themselves and finding new services and providing new services. But oftentimes outside of a global pandemic, that can take a lot of energy, that can take a lot of time, that can take a lot of resources. So when you're trying to reinvent yourself when your staff is not with you, when you're trying to reinvent yourself when those who you're providing service to may or may not be infected, this all becomes a whole lot more complicated to succeed in reinvention.
Yes, definitely. And I think, what we're not seeing is information on the quality of these services or the quality of education that, for example, that these children are receiving. And I know there's probably a lot to be desired in that area, but charities are making do with what they have, and trying to continue some semblance of their programs where they're able.
Let's go on to the next slide, because there's the next thing that we want to share with our funders is, I think, truly important part of the survey that we found, Jessie, because there's sort of a divergence in sort of those who closed early and what that looked like and why they had to close, and what we're seeing now in terms of the third that feel they're going to likely close in the next 12 months, which those feel that they're likely to close because of lack of funding or diminishing funding. But Jessie, that's not the reason that those who closed early, who are already closed in the early days of the pandemic, what are some of the reasons that they closed? And it wasn't necessarily funding.
Yeah, I think that's what is most significant about this slide and this data, is that you'd assume that the lack of funding is what is causing these closures, but it represents only 23%. Only 23% of respondents said that they're not operating because they ran out of funds. So there are many other reasons that have caused the suspension of operations. So one of them is that they're a volunteer-based organization and they've lost their volunteers. So that's a significant response, and something we've seen in many organizations, even within those that are still currently operating, that they are struggling due to a loss of their volunteer base. Another reason that they're not operating is because they don't have access to technology and infrastructure needed for remote operations. We actually made a grant to an organization that had 0 remote capacity, and with our grant, they were able to fully fund their digital capacity, and so they're operating fully remotely with not that large of a grant. It just shows, I think, in that instance, how important every dollar is, and how much it can do to keep operations running. And the other reason for organizations that have stopped their operations is that their services simply can't be provided online. So it's just an in-person service that they have been unable to continue.
Yeah, I was just talking to a charity a couple of days ago that all of their services were providing direct service to other charities. And none of it was digitized, and they're not able to go into the offices of other charities to provide service. And so their capacity, while they would like to digitize, they can't do that fast enough, and they can't train their staff on digitizing their services fast enough. And the charities that they would want to provide service to are no longer available for the service. So it's sort of, for them, it's like the worst of all worlds. Let's go to the next slide, because so what we just shared with our donors, as you just said, very important to know that in the early days, those who closed were not necessarily because of funding, but clearly in the reports that we see now, those that believe that they're likely to close, forecasting that they're likely to close, it is because of a decline or lack of funding. This slide really shows that, Jessie, 16.27% of those in this survey did not receive any funding in the last month. And Jessie, that's almost the same number of charities that did not receive any funding in our last survey as well, while others are seeing significant decrease in the size of the grants that are being provided by long-term donors. Talk to us a little bit about this, because what we saw in the earlier surveys is, many of those that are providing direct support are seeing their costs go up because of, PPE and the need to keep their staff safe, and the cost of doing business, and the number of people that are relying and needing their services at the same time that they're seeing funding go down. And any business would have a tough time meeting increased demand with decreased revenue.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'm hopeful that it's not the same 16% that are reporting in both reports that they didn't receive funding, because that would certainly be a challenge for that organization. But and that's something we're looking into in comparison of the last two surveys. But so this is tough. And I think the organizations that are responding in this way are probably relying on their reserves, which, most organizations have a year at most in their reserves. And that's, going to run out sooner. And I'm certain that it's probably the same 16% that are part of the third that will be closing soon, or fear that they'll be.
It's very likely that, when you're looking at your projections and you're losing funding, or you're losing significant grants, your forecast is not going to be a rosy one. Let's go to the next slide, Jessie, because those that did receive funding in the last month, in at least in theory, better shape than those who received no funding in the last month. Where did that funding come from? And are there any sort of silver linings here? Is there good news? Because there's a little bit of hope. There's some green shoots here.
Yeah, I think the small increase that we're seeing in the new donor category is promising. It's small, but it's something. And as we know, in the last month, organizations have been trying different or alternative fundraising methods to make up for their losses, or to make up for the cancellation of their normal in-person fundraising activities, such as 5K runs and galas and things like that. But many new donors also come from these in-person events. So I'm sure this is lower than what they normally would see if they were engaging in these types of activities. But nevertheless, I think that small increase is good. And we know that new fundraising methods take time so I'm hopeful that because they're really just starting to think about these new methods, that we'll start to see some improvement in the next few months.
Jessie, I'm just wondering, it's not a big change, and hopefully it's not a signal of a big change, but a slight downturn report over report on the long-term donors. Is that an early indication of some donor fatigue?
Yeah, I do think that that's a risk that we run here as well. I know that every donor, you're receiving emails from all of your charities talking about how they're coping and what their needs are, and their, I've received those email blasts, every day. And there's certainly fatigue around that. And, it's hard to face what you can't solve as a long-term donor. And so I think we're going to start seeing a little bit more of that, but hopefully charities can think of different ways to engage with these donors in creative ways to ensure that they continue to stay on their radar on a day-to-day basis. I think one really interesting fundraising activity that came back through the survey results was that an organization had set up a trivia game that they play with their donors and engage, a way to engage with their donors, and then there's a donation option at the end. And they seemed to have a lot of hope in that method, but just to speak to some of the creativity that we're seeing.
As a way to keep the conversation going. Yeah. Before we move on to the next slide, Jessie, we're on to volume 3 here. These surveys have just provided such rich and compelling data in the middle of a global pandemic that none of us expected to be working with and living through. What has this meant to donors as you and your staff of advisors are on the phone and working with donors who are really trying to figure this out and make a difference? What are you hearing about how they're trying to make sense of this data and now today with volume 3?
Yeah, I think the general donor group is feeling a lot of hopelessness themselves. I think everyone has only so much funding to draw from, and I think another challenge that we're going to see moving forward is that, particularly with corporations, they've spent a lot of their annual budgets on their annual philanthropy budgets on immediate relief, and I'm hoping that and we're talking to some donors about ensuring that they're saving some for the long term and providing longer term relief to their partners, because that will be important. But yeah, I think there's increased uncertainty in the donor group of, will I be able to sustain my additional support for as long as we're expecting this to continue?
Mm-hmm. Our next volume 4, Jessie, the next edition of this will be looking at the donor and the donor experience during this global pandemic and being a donor to charities. So looking at the other side of this and what their experience has been like, and I think that's going to be very telling, and I think helpful for donors to see what their peers are, what that experience has been like and how they're making decisions. Let's go to the next slide, Jessie, because the next slide is almost sort of like a menu, isn't it? That's has developed sort of organically as we've been at Krafft America looking at various options and working with donors and working with charities in terms of what would be helpful to charities who are providing service and trying to continue to provide operations. At the same time, what will meet the strategic efforts of the donors that we work with and represent. So can you walk us through sort of how these various donor responses work and how you and the advisors at Krafft America are helping donors implement these?
Yeah, this data is important because it really shows the extent to which donors are recognizing the need to be flexible and creative with their partners, even in situations where typically they're used to, closely restricting their funds to certain programs when they make a grant to an organization. We're seeing that open up a lot, and we're seeing a lot of creativity and flexibility on the part of donors as well. But we are still hearing some stories of donors that are still requiring charities to follow the same project timelines, which of course is creating a lot more stress for the charities. So we're working through that. But so some of these are really great and important steps that donors have taken. So first of all, the grant extensions have been really important. Of course, we've heard many stories, and we've been allowing a lot of grant extensions ourselves for organizations that are not able to follow the original timelines that they had agreed upon in our grant agreements. Changes of grant purpose have also been incredibly important because not only are there some cases where they can't follow the timelines, but the project itself might no longer be feasible because it was in person or a variety of other factors that are causing them to have to cancel that program completely. So we're working with them to reallocate funding and write a new grant agreement with them on how they can spend those funds in an alternative way. And that's been really important. And I'm so glad to see that's happening at a 39% level. 39% have responded to say that that's happening. Flexible funding, again, I think donors are more willing to support overhead and unrestricted costs or support costs generally, which normally they would only be willing to support program expenses. And related to that is need-based funding. So ensuring that your grants are going to the areas of most need and having those conversations with charities up front. So I think all of these are really important. And I think another thing that corporate donors should consider within this is the possibility of in-kind donations where that's applicable for your company. Things like food and computers and other items are in really high demand. And if you have access to that type of in-kind product, you might be able to stretch your philanthropy dollar further and have a huge impact in different ways if you're able to provide that type of in-kind support. So that's something for the corporate audience to consider.
Jessie, one of the other stress points for charities has been in some areas they've really relied on corporate volunteers, which have been more difficult to come by. Many of them may be out of work or maybe under stay-at-home orders. That's also become a real difficult issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And we work with many corporate volunteer programs that have been forced to cancel, and those corporations are trying in their stead to encourage even small donations from those employees in lieu of the time that they would have volunteered through that corporate volunteer program. So we're hopeful that will mean an increased funds to these organizations, but still, it has a huge impact when organizations have come to rely on that huge support from their volunteers. And another point to, in terms of donor response is that, the large partnerships are really important, but it's also important to focus on the small grassroots organizations. Some of the feedback we received in regard to this question specifically was that some of the smaller organizations feel that they're being overlooked while they see the very large organizations around them receiving millions of dollars from their donors. So I think in terms of thinking about resilience and flexibility and funding of our charitable sector generally, it's also important to focus on the smaller organizations.
Absolutely. And I think we wanted to just make a point of the final statistic here. It's not meant to point fingers at donors saying that there's a 14, almost 15% that refused to offer flexibility. The charities were responding to the way the question was written is that it was not offered or requested by 15%. So it's not necessarily meant to suggest that some donors are not willing to be flexible. As a matter of fact, our experience is that the vast majority of donors are quite interested in learning how to be flexible, appropriately flexible, and how their grant program can work within regulatory compliance to be flexible. Is that right?
Yes.
Jesse, let's move on to the next slide. We specifically in this volume 3 wanted to get into some of the issues that were raised in volume 1 and volume 2, and that is specifically some of the tactics that charities are trying to undertake to keep their doors open, to raise more money, to make differences. In this case, we asked, did your organization engage in new fundraising activities? Walk us through what we learned in the survey here.
Yeah, so I loved seeing that 63% are engaging in new activities. I think that's really important for the ongoing sustainability of these organizations. And we're seeing creative solutions, as I mentioned before, to some of this fundraising. But there are still, 36% still said that they are not engaging in new activities. So we'll see how this works moving forward for both sides of it. And then comes the question, what were those new efforts successful? 12% didn't raise any money from these new initiatives. 72% were still unable to meet their targets, and only about 17% met their targets.
And of course, Jessie, we know these campaigns, in the best of times, are not easy to just create a campaign and to raise money, and during a global pandemic to start something completely new and to raise new money it's a high bar.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. Fundraising is never a simple endeavor, but certainly not so during this time.
So Jessie, for donors who are asking questions of CAF America, let's go on to the next slide, and they're wondering what are charities in need of. Help us understand, if they're looking to understand what needs to be funded, what is money needed for?
Yeah, so very clearly at the top of this is that the operational cost that they're most in need of is support for their salaries. And just going back to a statistic from last month's survey, 60% of organizations in our volume 2 survey said that they were reducing operational costs, and 29% said that they were either furloughing or laying off employees as a reaction to reduced funding. So it's really not surprising here to see that the majority of the need in terms of the operational costs is support for salaries in order to sustain their organizations. Technology is also a really clear need as organizations move toward remote work and digitizing services where possible. So again, not surprising to see that at the top. But then, as Ted has mentioned previously, as offices open up and more people are going back into in-person activities, they're going to need support to improve the safety of their offices to resume on-site operations, such as purchasing PPE or plastic screens for between client or beneficiary and the charity itself, or the charity employees. They also need support for office rent and utilities. And really we're seeing a huge need for operational costs generally, but I think it's significant that salaries are up there at the top, as
Right.
employees are the most important resource in most of these organizations.
Because for anyone to just return to the office, there is no such thing as just return to the office. It's a retooling of the office. It's a retraining of the staff. It's a retooling of how your work is going to be done. It's for any organization, it's an expensive effort. Let's go on to the next slide. We continue to ask questions about charities and their response to coronavirus. Are they providing direct response? And of course, throughout this survey, what we have found, I think that Jessie, this has been very helpful to our donors to know that response and charities' involvement in the global pandemic is very broad. It spans the spectrum from not being involved at all to all the way to being frontline relief services and everything in between. So help us understand what that spectrum looks like, and donors' involvement in funding the complete spectrum, not just the front line.
Right. Yeah. So I think one thing that's interesting and important to consider in this slide is that some parts of the world do not have coronavirus cases, but they're still seeing a huge impact, mostly an economic impact to the COVID-19 pandemic that's affecting the entire world, even if it's not in their country. There's this quote from an organization in Tuvalu. They said that their country is still safe from the coronavirus, but they are now affected by lack of food and other medical supplies due to the lockdown of imported goods from overseas. So I think then going to the right of this slide, I think that explains the prominence of the 61% that's providing essential services as a response to the coronavirus, because there is of course an enormous need in this frontline relief effort that's taking place around the world, but the ripple effects and the number of people that the ripple effects are affecting is greater and further widespread. So it's important that many of these organizations are focusing on these essential services. In South Africa, for example, they're impacted more by hunger than the virus itself. So that's something that's important to consider in the relief efforts that donors are providing or what they're funding.
Yeah, Jessie, I think that's a good example of what we're seeing sort of laid bare is, problems in society that existed before the global pandemic have only been exacerbated, have sort of been accelerated and sort of brought to the forefront. And hunger in South Africa is certainly one of those examples. Let's go to our last slide here. Jessie, there's a lot of resources that CAF America has and continues to provide in response to this COVID-19 global pandemic. Do you want to just walk through and share with our audience today those resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So the next podcast we have coming up is another edition of our Front Lines of Philanthropy, questions you have, answers you need in regard to this. In this podcast, we've been addressing, and this is the third volume of it, we've been addressing different questions that are frequently coming up from our donors and the responses that we provide or that we've been seeing as we move forward. And so that's always an engaging conversation. We continue to work with charities to extend their eligibility where needed. And we are continuing to update our COVID-19 response page with the list of organizations that are responding to this relief effort. And then we have all of our webinars posted, our past webinars at cafamerica.org/webinars. And we continue to provide new podcasts on these topics as they arise.
Terrific. Thank you, Jessie. Thank you. And I see that our good friend from CAF South Africa, Jill Bates, is here, and she's saying that she completely agrees with the observations of escalating starvation in South Africa, which has been made worse. And we're hearing these stories from all over the world that the problems that existed are only being made worse by the global pandemic. And that's our webinar for today. So we're all set.
We'd like to thank you all once again for joining us, and we'll send the recording and the presentation as well as a link to the full report shortly after this. And everyone have a great rest of your day.